Have you ever wondered what your mind would look like? Would it be a room, a corridor that keeps turning back on itself? Would it have walls? Or would it stretch on forever until you couldn't tell where you ended and the world began? If someone could step inside that place, into the fog of your own mind, what would they find? Would it be peaceful? Or would it try to protect itself, twisting memory into walls, grief into weather, guilt into flesh? It's a strange thought that our emotions might not stay inside us, but could spill outward, shaping the world in their image. That the streets around us might be nothing more than a map of what we feel. Not nightmares exactly, but what it might look like if the invisible life beneath our skin finally took form, and does not take kindly on us or anyone near us. We will explore this idea today through three lenses in different languages and mediums. A video game, a book, and a philosopher. They have never met, but somehow they're all describing the same place. Released in 2001, Silent Hill 2 arrived during a transitional moment in a horror game design. The late 1990s had defined the survival horror genre through Resident Evil's cinematic framing, fixed cameras, and action puzzles. While titles like System Shock 2 and Fatal Frame began pushing toward the psychological, Team Silence, a small division within Konami, took a different path altogether. Instead of building spectacle or refining mechanics, they built atmosphere. The game rejected conventional structures of threat and reward, replacing them with a quiet kind of dread, horror without escalation. Its environments are washed in colorless light. Textures bleed into one another beneath a constant visual static. The now iconic fog that envelops the town is not merely a tactical trick to obscure distance, it is the game's central metaphor. It reduces vision and clarifies emotion. It makes the player feel as though the world has collapsed inwards, leaving only what the mind can bear to see. Sound design completes the sensation. The hum of fluorescent lights, the drag of metal, the occasional roar that might belong to machinery or to something breathing. Silence itself becomes a motive, an acoustic fog that isolates the player from the world beyond the screen. The story opens in ambiguity. James Sunderland, an unremarkable man, receives a letter from his deceased wife, Mary, asking him to meet her in their special place in Silent Hill. The premise is impossible, yet James accepts it without question. The letter, if believed, obliterates the distinction between memory and reality. His decision to follow it is his first act of repression, the conscious refusal to confront loss. The journey that follows is not a quest to find Mary, but to preserve the illusion that she might still exist somewhere, just out of sight. As James descends deeper into Silent Hill, the town reveals itself not as a physical location, but as an affective landscape, an environment structured by emotion rather than logic. Streets shift and fold like recurring thoughts. Buildings that once held meaning are repurposed into psychological traps. The game's inconsistencies, vanishing objects, contradictory timelines, and impossible architecture are not flaws but functions. They externalize James' own instability, his inability to sustain a coherent version of reality. Silent Hill reacts to him. It mirrors his internal state, staging encounters that oscillate between confession and punishment. Each space becomes a test of proximity to the truth. The closer James comes to remembering, the more distorted the world becomes. His experience is less narrative than recursive, not progress through a plot, but movement through denial, guilt, and the slow weathering of repression. James is not alone in Silent Hill, but the people he meets are not companions in any conventional sense. They're not there to help him survive, solve puzzles, or share exposition. They are mirrors. Each one reflects a different way of being trapped inside oneself, a different relationship to guilt, denial, and suffering. They're not supporting characters, they're other selves, wandering their own psychic limbos. Maria is the most central and uncanny of these figures. She appears as a woman identical to Mary, yet more vivid, styled, sensual, and flirtatious. She embodies the fantasy of who Mary might have been if illness had not consumed her, or who James wishes she could have remained. A partner unburdened by fragility, available, forgiving. But Maria is unstable from the moment she appears. She dies repeatedly only to return moments or hours later without explanation. Her personality is subtly shifting each time. Each return undermines her reality until she becomes less a person than the operation formed by James' desire and shame. Her final transformation, accusatory, echoing Mary's voice, collapses the boundary completely. Maria is not a ghost, nor a hallucination. She's a condensation of emotion, a psychic construct born from repression, the dream of absolution turned inside out. Angela Orozco occupies another kind of purgatory. When James meets her, she too is searching for her mother, she says. Though it becomes clear that she really is searching for something irretrievable, her speech is hesitant, fractured, carrying the weight of unspeakable trauma. Slowly the pieces surface: sexual abuse at the hands of her father, and the complicity or silence of those around her. Angela's Silent Hill is not James's. Her world is not fogged, it burns. The spaces she enters are choked with flame. Her environment's visibly hostile. Her trauma is a disguise or deferred, it consumes everything. On a burning staircase, as James pleads with her to leave, Angela replies, "This is what it's like for me. It's always like this." Her descent is complete, and it ends in disappearance. Angela reveals a contrast that defines the game's moral spectrum, where James represses guilt into fog and denial. Angela's pain is externalized and total. There is no repression left to protect her. Eddie Dombrowski represents it another variation on the same structure. At first he seems merely awkward, a nervous young man trying to joke his way through fear. But this laughter soon sounds wrong, defensive and hollow. As the game unfolds, it becomes clear that Eddie is violent, possibly psychopathic, though his aggression is always framed as self-defense. He is certain that the world has mocked him, hunted him, deserved his retaliation. His paranoia transforms the town into a reflection of hostility. Everyone is an enemy, every gaze an accusation. By the time James confronts him, Eddie has murdered at least one person, perhaps more. His world has narrowed to a single truth, that violence is justification. In psychological terms, Eddie externalizes everything James internalizes. Where James's violence falls inwards, becoming guilt and depression, Eddie bursts outward reframed as righteousness. They are two ends of the same mechanism, projection and denial, operating in opposite directions. Silent Hill gives both forms physical space. James' world of fog, Eddie's world of confrontation. And then there's Laura, the only character untouched by the town's distortions, a young girl of around 8 years old. Laura knew Mary from the hospital where she spent her final days. She appears suddenly, often taunting James, calling him names, mocking his grief. Yet her defiance conceals something profound. Laura sees the town as it truly is, ordinary, uncorrupted. She walks its street without fear or monsters because she carries no guilt for the town to shape. Her perception is pure, unmediated by repression or trauma. Her innocence, however, is not naivety. She understands what James cannot, that his narrative of devotion and loss is built on omission. When she calls him a liar, the accusation cuts deeper than any monster's blade. Laura embodies a reality unclouded by guilt, a moral horizon the player is forced to glimpse but cannot reach. She reminds James and us that the fog is not weather but psyche. The town's horrors are not in Silent Hill itself, but in the perceiver. The narrative of Silent Hill 2 does not resolve linearly. Instead, it branches quietly beneath the player's awareness, tracking how James relates to Mary's memory. The game observes the smallest gestures, how often he examines her photograph, whether he listens to her letter, how he treats Maria. This micro-action shaped the conclusion, yet the player is never told that such system exists. The result is a form of invisible moral reflection. James's psyche is being read through behavior, not choice. Each ending functions less as resolution than as interpretation, a final image of how James's consciousness arranges itself. In Leave, James accepts what he has done, that he euthanized Mary, weary of her suffering and his own helplessness. He departs the town with Laura, not absolved but capable, perhaps, of living again. In Water, the same recognition leads not to renewal but to despair. James drives into the lake, seeking reunion through annihilation. In Maria, he chooses the illusion, Walking away with her and condemning himself to repetition, Rebirth extends denial to theology. James turns to occult ritual, imagining that forbidden knowledge might restore what guilt destroyed. And then there are the dark and the youthful endings. Absurd ruptures that parody the very idea of narrative coherence. They're not necessarily jokes so much as warnings. Meaning itself cannot survive total interpretation. The game's geography mirrors its psychology. Each location in Silent Hill 2 operates as Waypoint but as metaphorical chamber, a materialization of inner states. Brookhaven Hospital embodies institutionalized guilt and cognitive disintegration. It's where James's confusion between Mary and Maria reaches its peak, where desire and denial become indistinguishable. The Woodside and Blue Creek apartments are claustrophobic and decaying, their looping corridors reflecting introversion and self-containment. These are the spaces of repression, where nothing leaves and nothing arrives. The Silent Hill Historical Society initiates the game's central descent, a literal and psychological spiral leading into Toluca prison, spaces that strip away any illusion of normality. Here the player moves downward into what feels like the architecture of punishments, the unconscious given form. Finally, the Lakeview Hotel stands as the town's heart and the story's emotional core. It is both sanctuary and tomb, the site of James and Mary's last moments together, now submerged underwater and memory. Its flooded rooms and flickering projections collapse nostalgia into delusion. By the time James arrives, the hotel is no longer a place in time, but a composite of guilt, a structure made of what he refuses to forget. Even the game's mechanics reinforce this interior logic. Combat is slow and imprecise, turning every encounter into exhaustion rather than triumph. The game's system resists mastery. The map does not align perfectly with the terrain. Puzzles follow the logic of dream symbolism rather than design convention. Items are placed without rhythm or reason. The result is an experience of subtle estrangement. The player learns not to understand the world, but to endure it. Every design decision mirrors James' own confusion. Every dissonant sound a pulse from its interior. Silent Hill 2 does not simulate fear through external danger, but through ontological instability. It makes it inhabit the same uncertainty that defines James himself, a consciousness oscillating between repression and revelation. From the very beginning, Silent Hill 2 invites distrust towards its own protagonist. James Sunderland's story never quite holds. His insistence that he received a letter from his deceased wife is presented with corroboration. The camera in the opening scene seems to confirm that distance, framing James from behind, reflected in the mirror. His voice unsteady and affectless. The words sound rehearsed, like something told too many times to be fully believed. The game never challenges his claim directly, but he never affirms it either. The silence around him becomes the first contradiction. This dissonance is the psychological core of Silent Hill 2. James constructs a fantasy to escape unbearable knowledge, and the player becomes complicit in maintaining it. The game's structure depends on that complicity. We follow the same path of denial, driven not by trust in James's story, but by the human need for coherence. The illusion sustains itself until it can no longer do so. Then comes Maria, and with her the illusion begins to splinter. She enters not as companion but as a disturbance in the narrative field. Her resemblance to Mary is uncanny, exact, yet off by a degree that keeps recognition unstable. Her behavior shifts fluidly, affectionate then mocking, fragile then cruel. Every emotional register feels both familiar and performative, as if she's cycling through the roles James needs her to play. Her repeated deaths, each time followed by seamless reappearance, obey no rational order but echo the logic of dramatic repetition. Maria does not exist in the world of the story, she exists because of James. She is a symptom, given shape. Spatial design reinforces mental recursion. Silent Hill is a geography of repetition. The player's sense of progress collapses into déjà vu. Every attempt to move forward returns to an early emotional state, slightly altered but unresolved. This is not simply environmental storytelling. The game introduces the phenomenology of circularity, progress that feels illusory, orientation that collapses into confusion. What the player experiences is not a traversal of space, but a rotation of thought. Like intrusive memories, the town's designer refused to let James, the player, escape the loop. The loop James inhabits is not empty. It is populated by manifestations of internal material made flesh, emotions given body, affect translated into matter. Pyramid Head stands foremost among them, a figure whose design fuses opposing functions. He is both executioner and victim, hunter and martyr. He performs the punishments James cannot consciously administer, staging ritualistic executions of Maria in scenes that evoke both guilt and voyeurism. Every appearance of Pyramid Head is a confrontation with the impossibility of atonement. His brutality is never arbitrary, is mechanical, procedural, as though carrying out a sentence written in the texture of the world itself. The nurses' faces and contorted emerge from James's memory of Mary's illness. Overlaid with unresolved sexual guilt, the exposed skin and bandaged heads signal both desire and blindness, objects of fixation and avoidance at once. They move in spasmodic rhythm, mechanical yet intimate. The mannequins, composed only of limbs and torsos, reduce the human form to fragments. They lack identity, purpose and orientation, embodying dismembered self-perception, the way shame divides body from consciousness. These figures are not metaphors in the symbolic sense, but ontological expressions of James's psychology. They do not merely represent emotional states, they are those states, made visible through form. They exist not to test the player's reflexes, but to reveal the terrain of the unconscious, a space where guilt becomes erotic, fear becomes familiar, and the boundary between subject and object dissolves entirely. To move through Silent Hill is to experience a form of dissociation. External detail fades, logic thins, emotion becomes the primary sense. Unlike classic survival horror, which imagines escape from invasion or contamination, Silent Hill 2 denies the existence of any outside. There is no untouched world to return to, no normalcy awaiting restoration. The town ends abruptly in fog-choked cliffs and bottomless lakes, its perimeter defined not by geography, but by psychic limit. The horror of Silent Hill 2 is not death, but entrapment, the state of being enclosed within one's own unfinished emotions. Its terror is existential, not supernatural. The enemy is not otherness, but the self's inability to step beyond itself. Philosopher Michel Henry once wrote that true life never appears in the world, it only feels itself. Michel Henry was a French phenomenologist who developed a radical interior philosophy of experience, where thinkers like Husserl and Merleau-Ponty examined how the world appears to consciousness, the structures of perception, attention and intention. Henry turned away from the visible altogether. His concern was not how things show themselves to us, but what happens before anything is seen, the raw, immediate fact of being alive and feeling. He called this auto-affection. The term sounds technical, but its meaning is simple. Auto-affection describes how life experiences itself directly, without meditation or distance. Before we think, before we look, we are already feeling the warmth of presence, the ache of anxiety, the quiet pulse of being. The sensations do not come from the outside, they are self-generated, self-felt. For Henry, this interior life is the ground of all of meaning. We are not human because we think or see, we are human because we feel ourselves existing. The feeling is invisible, you cannot point to grief, guilt or longing as you might to a tree or a wall, and it is more immediate than any object in the world. The invisible for Henry is not absence but intimacy, but can never appear because it is what every appearance depends on. Visibility in this sense deceives. The world surfaces, its images, objects and representations distract us from what is most real. Beneath perception lies another order of experience. Life that does not appear, that cannot be looked at, only endured. It trembles inside us, constant and inarticulate, suffering and desire in equal measure. This is the heart of Henry's thought. Life is not something we observe, it is something we feel. It reveals itself only in affect, in the silent immediacy of pain, joy and guilt. The visible world is merely a shadow, an echo cast by what never ceases to feel itself from within. In his major works, The Essence of Manifestation and I Am the Truth, Michel Henry draws a distinction between two modes of manifestation, the exterior and the interior. The exterior mode belongs to visibility and objectivity, to what Henry calls the world, the realm of light, space and representation. This is a domain in which things appear to us, measurable, distant and describable. This is how we encounter everything from landscape to people, as objects presented before our gaze. The interior mode by contrast belongs to life, not life as biological process, but life as pathos, as immanent self-experience. In this mode there is no distance, no mediation, no separation between the one who feels and what is felt. Life reveals itself only to itself in pure affectivity. The world shows things, life suffers and enjoys itself. Henry argues that the entire tradition of Western metaphysics, from Plato to Heidegger, has privileged the visible world over this invisible life. Philosophy has pursued knowledge through light, clarity and representation, thereby covering over what is most fundamental, the unseeable truth of the existence that each of us endures from within. The Phenomenology of Silent Hill 2 can be read as dramatization of this distinction. The game systematically erodes the separation between subject until neither remains intact. There is no sunlight, no stable horizon, no exterior perspective from which to look. The world has folded inward. Fog, silence and distortion are not environmental effects but emotional textures. The town does not offer objects for inspection, it offers atmosphere in habitation. The town becomes the visible articulation of Henry's invisible life. James' descent then is not geographical but ontological. He does not sink through layers of architecture, he sinks through layers of perception. From the world's exterior light into the interior night of emotion, his journey marks a passage from seeing to feeling, from distance to claustrophobic immanence. Henry's claim that life never appears but only feels itself finds its aesthetic expression in every aspect of Silent Hill 2 design. It does not illustrate guilt, it renders guilt's phenomenological structure as environment. It does not depict grief, it transforms grief into the only possible mode of being. The link between James Sunderland and Michel Henry is not interpretive but structural. James does not encounter monsters in the ordinary sense, he encounters his own auto-affectional life, made visible. His guilt is not narrated, it is embodied, replayed and externalized. Henry wrote that the visible world conceals the essence of life, that we are distracted by what appears and in doing so lose contact with what we feel. Silent Hill 2 inverts this relation. It removes the external world altogether, forcing the interior to expand until it becomes landscape. The result is not clarity but exposure, the unbearable visibility of what was never meant to appear. For Henry, the invisible life trembles beneath the surface of things. In Silent Hill it rises. It takes form as fog, the border between appearance and feeling, light and self. And in another story, written long before, that same invisible life found another shape. There it did not appear as fog, but as a tunnel. Ernesto Sabato was a figure whose life traced the long arc of 20th century disillusionment. Trained as a physicist, he earned a doctorate and worked at the Curie Institute in Paris. Immersed in the rational optimism of modern science, yet the atrocities of the Second World War and the realization that reason had failed to restrain barbarity provoked a deep personal intellectual crisis. Sabato abandoned physics, convinced that logic and empiricism were powerless to reach the darker strata of human experience. Turning to literature, he sought not to explain the world, but to reveal the limits of explanation, to write from the place where knowledge falters and only confession remains. Published in 1948, The Tunnel was Sabato's first major literary work and an immediate statement of his new direction. The novel aligned him with the post-war existentialists, resonating with writers such as Albert Camus, who praised Sabato's lucid portrayal of inward collapse. Yet where Camus confronted absurdity through rebellion against the silent world, Sabato's gaze turned inward. His existentialism is not heroic but claustrophobic, stripped of grandeur, self-absorbed, recursive. His characters do not resist meaninglessness, they are engulfed by the impossibility of communication, trapped in solipsistic enclosures of feeling. The threat in the tunnel is not the absence of meaning, but the impossibility of being understood. The novel is narrated entirely in the first person by Juan Pablo Castel, a painter imprisoned for the murder of Maria Iribarren, and yes, confusingly this Maria shares her name with both Mary and, well, Maria from Silent Hill 2, a coincidence that will test our ability to concentrate. What unfolds is not a legal account, but a philosophical confession, an autopsy of motive and emotion. Castel does not seek forgiveness, he seeks justification. He writes to prove, at least to himself, that his crime was necessary, perhaps even inevitable. Yet his narration never stabilizes. Each attempt to explain his act fractures under the pressure of doubt. He circles endlessly around moments of miscommunications and suspicion. Castel's obsession begins with a moment so ordinary it almost escapes notice. A brief encounter at an art exhibition. In his painting Maternity, Castel had embedded a minor detail, a small figure of a woman gazing through a window at the sea, which he believed contained the work's only authentic expression of truth. Maria Iribarren is the only viewer who perceives it. This silent act of recognition fractures his psyche. Maria's gaze becomes, for Castel, a revelation proof that someone has finally seen into the hidden chamber of his being. What for her is likely a passing moment becomes, for him, a metaphysical event. The collapse of distance between self and other, a communion of absolute understanding. From that instant onwards, Maria ceases to exist as a person and becomes a projection, the embodiment of Castel's need to be seen. What unfolds is not a love story, but a progressive distortion of relationality. Castel does not seek to know Maria, he seeks to preserve her as the fixed image that confirms his identity. Any deviation from that image, and a sign that she possesses her own interiority, her own contradictions, becomes intolerable. He begins to follow her, interrogate her, interpret her every sign as a revelation or betrayal. His conviction that she is the only genuine being in a world of failsness hardens into an axiom that reorders his entire perception. This is not romantic fixation, it is the ontological dependence. Without Maria, the scaffolding of his reality collapses. The fragility of this construction becomes evident the moment Maria resists his idealization. Her relationship with others, especially her blind husband, destabilizes Castel's fantasy. He cannot perceive her as a complex individual. He reads every gesture through the binary of faithfulness and treachery. The mere existence of other people in her life becomes a metaphysical threat. His love mutates not into hatred but into a desperate search for coherence. When reality no longer conforms to his internal model, Castel's mind fractures. What begins as a jealousy evolves into a dissociative structure of thoughts. He splits from the world, detaches from perception, and spirals inward into the very tunnel that gives the novel its name. The murder of Maria is not premeditated in the legal sense, but is structurally inevitable. Castel kills not a person but the unbearable ambiguity she embodies. He cannot tolerate her multiplicity, her failure to remain a fixed object of recognition. The pure figure from the painting becomes the justification for her erasure, yet the act grants no resolution. The confession that follows is not a path towards self-awareness, but a futile attempt to rebuild coherence from within the wreckage. Castel's narration is cold, meticulous and self-scrutinizing, yet it never escapes his original delusion. Each explanation becomes a deeper recursion. The more he speaks, the further he redraws. The novel's deeper pathology lies in its yearning for purity, for absolute meaning, emotional certainty and perfect union. Castel's inability to accept ambiguity is not simple immaturity, it is existential rigidity. He cannot abide a world in which meaning shifts, in which a person can be both true and unknowable. That Maria could have perceived the hidden window in his painting and still loved another man is to him an impossibility. The idea that recognition does not entail possession destroys his fragile ontology. His desire is not for love, but for a world without shadows, without contradiction, without distance. This collapse mirrors the psychic terrain of James Sunderland in Silent Hill 2. Both men move through recursive architectures of meaning, trapped between projection and reality. Both construct idealized images of women to stabilize the disordered interiors, and in both the refusal to accept ambiguity culminates in destruction, not only of the beloved but the very capacity to relate. Castel seeks connection, but only on terms that eliminate the other's alterity. The result is a double failure, a failure of love and a failure of language. He speaks endlessly, but no dialogue ever occurs. In this sense, the tunnel and Silent Hill 2 articulate the same metaphysical structure. Both construct closed systems in which affect becomes the medium of being. Both depict the collapse of relation and the weight of projection. And both reveal the same ultimate horror, not the menace of the outer world, but the impossibility of ever escaping the interior one. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, approached the human psyche as a layered structure, governed not by reason, but by conflict, suppression, and return. Trained as a neurologist, yet disillusioned with purely biological explanations, Freud turned his attention to the unconscious, the hidden side where desires, traumas, unassimilated by consciousness, continued to exert force. He proposed that the repressed emotions, especially those tied to guilt, fear, or forbidden desire, never truly disappear. Instead, they return in distorted forms, as dreams, symptoms, slips of the tongue, compulsions, or displacements. This return of the repressed became the cornerstone of Freud's model of the mind. Repression was not mere forgetting, but active concealment, and projection, the process by which inner conflict is misattributed to the outer world, was one of its most vivid expressions. Through projection, the psyche retransforms its own turmoil into the apparent hostility or strangeness of reality itself. The world becomes a screen for what consciousness cannot bear to see within. Freud's vision of the psyche was architectural. The unconscious formed a buried foundation, pressing upward upon the fragile surface of the ego. The ego struggled to maintain coherence while mediating between the primal drives of the id and the prohibitions of the superego. When this equilibrium failed, when inattention could no longer be contained, it overflowed into perception, reshaping how reality appeared. It is here that Freud's model begins to intersect with phenomenology, where Freud maps the structure of repression, Henry describes the texture of existence, but both converge on a single event, the eruption of inner life into the field of appearance. When affect becomes too intense to remain invisible, it does not simply manifest as emotion, it becomes the world. Together, Freud and Henry describe the same phenomenon from opposite directions. The invisible made visible. Freud gives us the mechanism, repression, projection, return. Henry gives us the metaphysics. Their convergence illuminates the condition of both Silent Hill 2 and the tunnel. When feelings exceeds containment, when the psyche can no longer translate itself into the shared grammar of language or perception, the result is not only a psychological break but a transformation of reality itself. The inner world expands until it devours the outer. In Mourning and Melancholia, Sigmund Freud drew a structural distinction between two psychic responses to loss. Mourning is a process that acknowledges absence and gradually withdraws the libido, the psychic energy from the lost object. Through mourning, the subject detaches, reorients and re-enters the symbolic order. The pain is real but productive. It marks a transition from the attachment to acceptance, from the past to the possibility of a new meaning. Melancholia, however, fails to complete this movement. The melancholic cannot release the lost object, instead they internalize it. The lost is not recognized as external and gone, but reconstituted within the ego. The result is a condition in which the subject is occupied, even defined, by what cannot be assimilated. The melancholic does not simply remember the lost object, they become it. As Freud writes, the shadow of the object falls upon the ego. This structure defines both James Sunderland and Juan Pablo Castel. Neither completes mourning, neither accepts the irreversibility of loss. James does not remember Mary with clarity or tenderness. He clings to her through distortion. Her letter, her imagined voice, her double form in Maria has the function as instruments of denial. His journey is not undertaken to honor her death, but to avoid confronting its reality. Mary is not mourned, she is reanimated. Castel's melancholia is more ideational, but no less consuming. His fixation on Maria begins before any relationship can properly exist, and when it ends in violence he cannot expel her from consciousness. She becomes his axis, the invisible point around which every sentence, every thought, and every recollection turns. The novel he writes is an attempt to understand her, but to preserve her. Her subjectivity disappears in the process. She ceases to exist as a person, and becomes structure within him, a vacancy that defines his existence. Castelli is not haunted by Maria as something external, he becomes her absence. In this transformation, the distinction between subject and object, self and other, begins to dissolve. Disappointment, grief, unable to release its object, folds in on itself and becomes dissociation. In psychological terms, dissociation is a defensive rupture, a mechanism the mind deploys when it encounters affect too intense to integrate. It manifests as fragmentation of identity, depersonalization, derealization, or general collapse in the coherence of perception. The subject may feel detached from their body, estranged from the world, or as if observing themselves from outside. These states are not disorders in the moral or colloquial sense, but strategies of preservation. When pain exceeds the psyche's capacity to symbolize or process it, consciousness severs itself from its own feeling. Dissociation is the cost of survival when emotion becomes untranslatable. This collapse is visible in both Silent Hill 2 and The Tunnel. In the game, it is not that James forgets where he is, it's that the place itself loses meaning. In Sabato's novel, each sentence reaffirms the impossibility of exit. The voice that seeks intimacy finds only echo. There is no distance left from feeling, no exterior surface against which thought can be measured or diffused. When immediacy replaces mediation, when intimacy arrives without the buffer of separation, the result is not union but collapse. The original longing to be seen, to know, to possess is founded on a fantasy of proximity, but when the proximity becomes absolute, when nothing stands between subject and object, the self is engulfed. In both narratives, the protagonists seek connection, yet their mode of connection is total identification. They do not desire relation but fusion, and fusion in these worlds is indistinguishable from destruction. The horror lies precisely in this collapse of space, when the object of desire becomes too close, too vivid, too unbearable to remain other. In Beyond the Pleasure Principle, Sigmund Freud introduced one of his most unsettling ideas, the death drive, or thanatos. Until then, his model of the psyche had been anchored in the pleasure principle, the notion that human behavior is governed by the pursuit of satisfaction and the avoidance of pain. But while studying trauma, repetition and compulsion and behaviors that seemed indifferent to survival or pleasure, Freud discerned something deeper. Beneath the drive toward life, there exists a contrary motion, a pull toward stillness, toward the inorganic, toward the cessation of tension. Thanatos is not simply a metaphor for self-destruction or aggression, it is the impulse of life to undo itself, to return the pre-subjective calm that precedes all differentiation. Where eros binds, builds and multiplies intensity, thanatos unbinds, quiets and dissolves. It is not opposed to life but intrinsic to it, the hidden symmetry of vitality and rest. This reframing maps directly on the final movements of Silent Hill 2 and The Tunnel. Both James and Castell enact violence that is not external in origin, but inward. Their actions do not arise from malice or rage, but from desperation, an attempt to quiet the unbearable resonance within. James's murder of Mary and his repeated reenactments of the loss to Maria's successive deaths are not sadistic acts. They are attempts to end the feedback loop of guilt and grief that has transformed his existence into unending noise. He does not kill to dominate, he kills to silence the self that cannot stop feeling. Castell's violence follows the same structure. Act is an attempt to erase contradiction, to force the world back into coherence, but even this gesture fails. The convergence of psychoanalysis and phenomenology reveals the depth of their suffering. James and Castell are not agents of cruelty or chaos, but figures of life at its limit, where the inner pulse of affect can no longer find expression, only implosion. Their violence is not purely destructive, it is sacrificial. It offers up both the world and the self that is only peace till imaginable, silence. I have lost people before, more than I care to count, and some I still can't talk about without my voice cracking halfway through the sentence. You see, the strange thing about loss is how invisible it feels. Everyone around you keeps moving, the world keeps turning, bills still fly in and nothing really stops. But something in you folds in on itself. The days still happen, but you're not quite in them. For a while I thought grief was a private country, a place only I could enter. But the longer I stayed there, the more I realized how small it was, how easily it closed around me. Grief protects you from the world, but it also hides the world from you. And that's the danger of grief. It doesn't just take away the one you've lost, the one you've loved. It threatens to take everyone else with them. The mind builds a little room for the dead, and sometimes it forgets to leave the door open. But grief, like fog, eventually begins to thin. Sometimes, not all at once, but sometimes just enough to see a few feet ahead. And the distance, that fragile reappearance of the world, is what saves us. Distance is what lets the world exist again. It's what turns feeling into compassion instead of obsession, grief into mourning instead of melancholia. Michel Henry saw life as an invisible pulse, each of us sealed within our own vibration of feeling. But maybe life also happens in the space between pulses, in the fragile distance where one life can feel another. James couldn't reach that space. Castell destroyed it. But we, sitting here, can feel both of them. We can hold their pain without being swallowed by it. That's what art gives us, the distance they lost. Art gives us form to what would otherwise consume us. It lets us name things that are too large to hold alone. You see, I think that's why I make things like this. Not just to explain Silent Hill 2 or Sabato or Michel Henry or Sigmund Freud, but because each time I try to understand them, I feel like I'm tracing the edges of my own fork. Each story, each idea, is another attempt to make distance visible, to give shape to what once drowned me. Maybe that's what all of this is for. These videos, these essays, these hours of thoughts. To reach for what James and Castell never could. To turn pain into something shareable, something that touches but doesn't devour. To teach us that the inner world is not the end of the outer one. It's just where we go to remember how to love it.